This video is a kind of response to a couple of people who've been in touch with me to say they were quite surprised by the videos that I made on certain aspects of reading rhythms, because the names of the different notes, like the whole note, the half note, the quarter note, and so on, were actually quite unfamiliar to them, and actually they'd learnt different names for all of these notes, and they wondered why that might be. Well, I decided to start with the standard American names for all of these notes, mainly because they're really helpful for telling us how these different types of notes are related to each other. So it makes sense that the half note is half of a whole note, and so we'd expect to get two of those half notes for every one whole note, and we do. Our half note is 2 beats in length, and the whole note is 4 beats, so it makes sense that we would get two halves to a whole note, and the same, we would expect to get 4 quarters in a whole and 2 quarters in a half, and all of these different relationships are very clearly laid out by the standard American names for the different note lengths. However, you might be able to tell from my accent that I am not American. I come from England, and in England and other parts of the world, we have slightly different names for the note lengths that we find in printed music. So just to make sure there's no confusion, I thought I would show you the European names for all of the notes that we've covered so far. So let's get started and have a look at the whole note. I'm sure we're starting to recognise it very easily now. It's that familiar egg shape. Now, while people in America know this is a whole note, I naturally think of this note as a semibreve. A semibreve looks and acts exactly the same way as a whole note. It lasts for 4 beats, and it's exactly the same thing. So all of these names are completely interchangeable. So someone might say a whole note, and I would know that this was a note that lasts for 4 beats. Equally, they might say a semibreve, and exactly the same thing, I would know it was a note that lasted for 4 beats. It's actually very useful to know both, particularly if you're going to work with other musicians from other parts of the world. So let's carry on. The name for a half note in Europe and other parts of the world is a minim. And we spell it like this, M-I-N-I-M. So the next note down is the quarter note. Very common, we see this all the time in the music we're playing. Lasts for 1 beat, of course, but I know this note as a crotchet. And we'll do a couple more. So the 8th note, and of course we get 8 of these for every whole note or semibreve. I would call that a quaver. And let's just do one more. We can obviously go into smaller divisions of beats than this, but we'll end with the 16th note, which I know as a semiquaver. And all the other ways that we've used to talk about some of these notes, like saying we might have a dotted half note, we would say we have a dotted minim, or instead of a dotted 8th note, we have a dotted quaver. So here's something you might be wondering. This type of note, as we've already said, is to Americans known as a whole note. And to those of us over in Europe, we call it a semibreve. So I suppose the question is, how can something that's supposed to be the equivalent of a whole note, as in it's all of something, have semi in it? Normally when we see semi in a word, it's telling us that it's a smaller part of something bigger. And actually you'd be right to think this, because in some old forms of music we see a different type of note, which we haven't looked at yet. It looks like this. I've always thought it looks a bit like a TIE fighter from Star Wars. It's very unlikely that you're ever going to come across this type of note unless you go and look in some very old church music, where sometimes you need to have very long notes, because this is a breve. It's so rare that when people in America were choosing how to talk about notes, they were quite happy for this type of note, the 4-beat semibreve, to be known as a whole note, because it was very rare, particularly by the time people in America were starting to think about music, that you would see this type of note in any kind of piece. However, when it does come up, Americans refer to this as a double whole note. And there'll be no prizes for guessing how long it lasts. That would be 8 beats. And there we go. I hope that clears up any confusion that you might have had. If you're ever playing music with friends, why not, for a bit of a fun exercise, try using the alternate set of names for the different note lengths than you're used to. Very quickly you'll not notice the change. And actually, it'll become very easy for you to switch between the two.